Hey guys, it's Evan with Evan K Exotics. It's late April 2025 and it's a big stormy weekend out there. But today's video is going to be talking around the questions, what is my ball python thinking? And does my boa like me? This video is talking about a lot of subjects that I'm kind of rubber banding around the term like reptile thinking and consciousness and sentience and emotions. And this is a pretty big squirrely subject, just like having two snakes in your hands during a video is a big squirrely thing to do. But I wanted to talk about these all together because I think that it's hard to be super concise about these ideas. I think they're all interrelated. And also I think that by talking about them all together, hopefully you get a little bit of a better understanding of what I think about these subjects of reptile awareness and reptile thinking and reptile emotions. So the first thing I'm going to put out there to you guys is that this is a generally hazardous subject to talk about. It's a generally controversial subject to talk about. And I think that oftentimes we tend to overconclude. And to the degree to which you can constrain your opinions about reptile conscience and sentience to things that are pretty discrete and defined, I think you'll be accurate, and to whatever degree you make big sweeping statements about animals, you are going to be inaccurate. So that's just the first thing I'd put out there. And the other thing I'm going to put out there to you is I could be wrong. If you think that I'm wrong or you have observations that support or refute what I'm saying here, go ahead and put them in the comments. I'd love to do that. And please like and comment and subscribe because I always love when you do that. So the first subject I want to talk about is anthropomorphizing animals in the hobby. And this is kind of the idea that you assign or you conceive of your animals in terms of human ideas and human emotions and human awareness and human feelings and human thought patterns. And in general, there's this kind of idea of not anthropomorphizing your animals, and that is generally, that advice comes out of the fact that there are some hazards to anthropomorphizing your animals. But in general, I'll tell you that anthropomorphizing animals is something that humans do. It's not something that animals do. So it's not like something like you're anthropomorphizing your ball python and then suddenly it becomes more human-like. You are ascribing human-like traits to it. And whether that's good, bad, or neutral just kind of depends on the situation in my mind. And I'll give you kind of examples of all of those. I think that an example of where anthropomorphizing your snake is good is if you're one of these people that thinks that your animal is so adorable. And this is something where you see with a lot of newer keepers, and I think it's actually a good thing, but when you're just like, oh, I love my snake, it's so cute, blah, 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 that actually might be a good thing because you're like, oh, look at him, he's cuddling or whatever. As long as you leave that on the shelf as just that's your human emotion and your affection towards that animal, I think that might actually be good for your animal because it means that you're more attuned to that animal and you're more likely to give it the care that it needs. So long as you're able to divest your human emotions from what its actual care needs are, I think that any way that you can positively attune to your animal is a good thing. In terms of how emotionally affectionate you are to your animals, and I'll never judge somebody for expressing their affection for the animal in an anthropomorphic way. All right. A way in which I think it's kind of neutral, or anthropomorphizing your animals being kind of neutral, is something that I do. I name most of my snakes. Okay, you know, this is Iman. This one's actually one of the few snakes that doesn't have a name, but I name most of my snakes, and that is something that is anthropomorphic. It is basically because one, kind of going back to like what I think about creating affection. By naming my snakes, it creates a little more affection or attunement to my animals. It's also just an easier way to think of things. So it's like, I'm gonna go feed Dot today rather than I'm gonna go feed that 2020 female Guyana BCC. It's just a little easier way for me to think about it. And you know, that's something, I'll tell you that the naming convention is something in the past has been poo-pooed upon, and there's certain communities and reptile keepers that still don't name their animals. But in general, that's just a neutral thing to do, but it is anthropomorphic, okay? And then a way in which anthropomorphizing might be negative for your animals is if you start to over-conclude about what they like. If you've ever seen people take their snakes out on a car ride or something like that, they're like, oh, I got my snake out for a cruise today and he was happy or whatnot like that. I just think that's anthropomorphizing. Snakes don't really like car rides. They can't like a car ride. And that's something where there are some risks. Or if you're like, I'm going to pull my boa constrictor out to parties so you can hang with me and my homies, that's negative anthropomorphizing. So that's just something I'll put out there for you that I think kind of belongs in this video. Now I'm going to kind of introduce some things that are more local to the actual animals that you're talking about. And the first concept is the idea of like Umwelten, an environment of evolutionary adaptiveness. And Umwelten is something that Tom Crutchfield promotes. It's an idea in ethology or animal behavior. And it's the idea that an animal's lived experience is a combination of its senses and its environment, and that is all going together to, it's a very slippery concept, but that all is synthesized through the animal, and that elicits its worldview and its behaviors. And so by that you can say that a snake is going to have a different Umwelten than I do because of its biological senses for heat-seeking ability. A dog is going to have a different Umwelten than I am because it has different senses than I do. It can't see color, but it has a wonderful sense of smell. And similar to this, these animals have been evolved and adapted over time, and that environment in which they evolved in creates a lot of their behavior and Umwelten and worldview. So the thing I'll tell you about this is that go look it up. It's a big concept in ethology, and it's pretty slippery to define, and it's hard to hold in your hand unless you're like more intelligent than I am. But the idea here is to just really, really understand that the snake, its senses are different than yours, its evolved history is different than yours, its life needs are different than you, its brain structure is different than you, and it has a very different Umwelten than you. So to whatever degree you are trying to understand what that snake is doing through a very specifically human lens, you're probably going off track. The less exclusively human the way you are conceiving of that animal or that snake is, the probably more accurate you're going to be. Okay. The next kind of subjects I want to talk about is like genus versus species versus individuals, and how that affects personalities and cognition and emotions. And the thing I will tell you here is that certain genuses tend to have certain prevailing tendencies. Species tend to have certain prevailing tendencies, but individuals tend to be very different. And it's kind of the idea that there's much more intra-variation within a species or a genus than there is inter-variation, meaning that the variation of all Antaresia pythons is going to be much more different than the variation between Antaresia genus and Morelia genus. Nevertheless, there's certain animals and certain species and certain genuses that have tendencies and emotional traits and intellectual and behavioral tendencies, and those all need to be balanced, if that makes sense. You need to honor the tendencies, but also recognize that there might be individual differences. And this is an example of where I think you really need to just hold this in your hand. There was an example a while back where this guy was asking about what would be a really good species of boa constrictor for an ambassador animal, wanting it to be good around kids, very handleable and safe. And I recommended a boa constrictor Imperador, and I made the comment that BCC are a little more nervous or snappy. And a couple of people chimed in, well, mine is not snappy and mine is blah, blah, blah. And, I just think that that's kind of silly. That's just not acknowledging the special and genus or the special level tendencies of animals. But at the same time, I can acknowledge that there can be a very, very calm BCC and a pretty nervous Imperador, if that makes sense. So there we go. Now I want to kind of talk about the ideas of traits and behaviors. And the difference between a trait and a behavior is, I could say, my boa likes mice. That's a trait. Or I could say, my boa very quickly strikes and eats mice. That's behavior. So that's a different way of talking about the same thing. One's traits and one's behavioral. And traits in general, I think, are kind of when we start getting into traits, we try to start putting snakes into boxes of human thinking and human emotions. And I would generally tell you to steer away from at least the very human-centric traits, liking, loving, all those things, cuddling, all that stuff. I think that you tend to go astray with there. And I think the more you can talk about behaviors, observable things that you can see your snake doing, the more accurate you'll be, or the less likely you are to over-conclude at least. And in general, we can be looking at these behaviors, and just the way I tend to think of things, not like or disliking, is I tend to think, Or is the snake experiencing it positively or negatively? Is it the snake feel that it's aversive or pleasurable? Is it reinforcing or punishing? Is it going to be more likely to do it again because of the what happened when it did that behavior, or is it less likely to do that? And I'll just tell you, like, for example, this snake has food bitten me and it wrapped me a couple times. And then it food bit me and it spit me out, because over time it knows that that sensation of biting my hand is aversive. It didn't get reinforced. So in general, I would tell you to think more along those lines. Is it positive or negative, or pleasurable or aversive, or is the snake more likely or less likely to do it in the future? And I do actually think that just by observing your animals, most people can kind of make that an accurate discernment of what their snake actually thinks, if you keep it down to that level, if that makes sense. Another thing that I make a point of is snakes are pretty modal and labile. And why that I mean, like Kevin Gurley talks about, they're in feed mode, they're in defense mode, they're in escape mode, whatever. Snakes are pretty are on or off with their emotions. They do have emotions. They're just a little different than human emotions, but they're generally pretty on or off. They're either in feed mode or they're not in feed mode. That's why you can tap hook a snake, and one that came flying out of the cage, you tap it, put it out of feed mode, and now it's safe to handle. So that's something I'll tell you. And in general, snakes tend to be pretty labile, meaning that their emotions go up and down and change much more frequently and much more easily than a lot of animals that we deal with. And that's just something I'll tell you. That's why snakes can be considered a little unpredictable, is because they're labile. That's just something. Certain species and genuses are more, and certain individuals are more labile than others, but lability in like modal ways of existing is something that I would say is a very snake trait. And if you're going to go down that lane of traits, I'll just even tell you that a lot, when we talk about traits for humans and things, that a lot of them are being shown not to be super accurate. But if you want to go through a matrix of traits to try to evaluate your snake on, maybe one of the more accurate ones for humans would be the ocean trait, which is something in psychology. You can look it up. I think it's openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, amicability, and neuroses. I think those are it. And if you start to think about, and you constrain human personality traits to ocean, that might actually be a good way to start thinking about snake traits in terms of a more human-like way. So if you start to think, how open is this snake to experiences? I have snakes that if I open the cage, they come right to the front of the cage. I have snakes that are very not open to that experience, and they're very cryptic. Maybe conscientiousness, that's probably not something you can really tell with a snake, but extroversion versus introversion of snakes, there's some that are just much more bold. Amicability, that's probably something you can assess in a snake, and neuroses is something you can probably assess in a snake. So that's just an idea. If you wanted to be sticking with those ideas of human traits more than behaviors, is something you could think about. Now we get into the one of intelligence, and intelligence is a really fraught idea with humans. I will tell you that it is very cultured, it is very ethnocentric, it is very much used as sorting mechanism to put people over each other. And so I don't even know that intelligence is something that we can talk about neatly with humans. But when we talk about intelligence with snakes, I will tell you that I'll give you two different ways to conceive of intelligence with humans that might work with snakes, okay? The first one is the idea of, I'm an anthropology major, and in anthropology we'll say intelligence is a human's ability to survive in its environment. And so you might consider a doctor or a Harvard professor very intelligent, but if you put him in the Sahara, he wouldn't be able to survive, and you would consider him unintelligent. And likewise, if you took that person from the Sahara and you put him in a clinical setting, you might think that he's unintelligent because he doesn't know how to operate in that environment, and vice versa. So the idea of intelligence is really relative to an environment. And I will tell you that in a captive environment, if you want to think about intelligence, my baby boa from my Guyana litter in 2024, I have one that doesn't really want to eat solidly right now. That one could be considered dumb, because if it doesn't eat in this captive environment, it might die, it might not survive. So that's a way to think of it being dumb. or evaluating intelligence based on its ability to survive in an environment. Another way to think about intelligence is how quickly an animal will change its behavior based on positive or negative outcomes. How quickly an animal conditions or deconditions or extinguishes a behavior based on the learned outcomes. And similar, taking the food example and using that to evaluate intelligence with an animal. I have a diamond python who will reliably, every time, bite and food wrap my hand. It is not extinguishing the food biting behavior on my hand, even though it never gets reinforced for that. It never gets a meal for biting and food wrapping my hand. In fact, it gets punished for that. It gets put under a water faucet sometimes. It gets sprayed with water. I have put a drip of Listerine in his mouth to get it to stop biting me. So that's an example of an animal that is doing the opposite behavior, feeding very robustly, but could be considered dumb because it's displaying slow rates of extinction of a behavior that's not reinforcing it, or it's displaying slow rates of conditioning through the punishment of getting ran under the water faucet to get it off of my hand. So the idea of intelligence, if you want to really think about it, is really one of those two ways. It's like, how well can this animal survive in this environment, or how quickly does this animal change its behaviors based on whether or not that behavior is positive or reinforcing. A snake that does the same thing that it doesn't like to do over and over again might be considered not as smart as one that bites you once and lets go. I have a Dumerul's python, not this one, that's bit me twice. The first time it bit and food wrapped me. The second time it bit me and spit me out immediately because it learned from the first time that it wasn't going to be reinforced by that. And so that was actually a smarter snake than my diamond python, if that makes sense, okay? The next thing I want to talk about is arousal levels in snakes, and arousals have to do with behavior and intelligence and emotions with snakes, I think a lot. And I think a lot of times when we're talking about emotions or behavior or intelligence or feelings or sentience with snakes, we're really just commenting on their arousal levels. And arousal is basically how much of a certain stimulus is an animal getting. The more of that stimulus it's getting and the more sensitive that individual animal is to that stimulus, the more aroused it will be. For example, when we say, if there's food scent in the room, that is a food stimulus. The more of that food scent that's in the room and the more sensitive a snake is to that food scent, that stimulation, the more highly aroused that animal will be. And so I think sometimes, like when we talk about an animal that is real snappy for food out of a cage, we're just talking about an animal that is highly aroused for food at a lot of the time. Or if we talk about, we're like, if like I kept Mexican or black milk snakes for a while, Korean black milk snakes, and my room was always pretty warm. And I used to say to myself, oh, well, they're too hot. The heat makes them mad. Well, the heat does not make them mad. The heat highly arouses them because they're ectotherms. So the stimulation of higher ambient temperatures is affecting them to the point of increasing their arousal. And for them, it made them real flighty and squirming. So it increased their escape arousal behavior. That arousal increased their escape behaviors. Or, they talk about with like Taiwan beauties, if you keep them too hot, they'll bite you. That heat stimulation will create excess arousal that creates a more defensive behavior. So the same stimulation, heat in the Costa Rican black milks creates an escape behavior, and in the Taiwan beauties creates a defense or biting behaviors. But that's all fundamentally arousal levels. If I have a female boa that's in season in here, it's going to create arousal stimulation in the males, and that's why you'll see that male boa constrictor like a rectangle and trying to open his sliding glass doors, because he's highly sexually aroused. So that's something I talk about. I think arousal is one of those things that's just not talked about with snakes a lot, but in general, I think that a lot of what we comment about is really just different levels of arousal when we're talking about their emotions, if that makes sense. Okay, so that's just something I'll put out there. And rounding this out, I want to talk about prey selection and sentience and emotions. And prey selection is one of those really interesting things. And actually, if I was going to get a PhD in anything, it'd probably be in animal behavior and be something around reptile prey selection, snake prey selection. And the more time I spend with snakes, the more I realize that they are not just voracious, indiscriminate eaters. Well, I don't want to lose you down somewhere. I don't want to lose you. But anyways, I think that snakes actually have a pretty large matrix of contingencies that need to be in place for them to have a feeding response. And this is why we oftentimes run into problems with getting snakes to feed, is because prey selection is not just indiscriminate. It has to have a certain number of contingencies in place before a snake will eat. It's a if-then type situation. If 4 of these conditions are met, then the snake will feed. If enough conditions are met to create enough of an imposition, then the snake will cascade into a feed response. And so these conditions are basically stimuluses. And so in some of the different stimuluses you're giving the animal has to be enough to create feeding. And so for a really strong feeding animal, or really well-established animal, maybe all it needs is the scent of a room temperature frozen thawed rodent to make contingency of it feeding. Most of my snakes in here, that's pretty much the only contingency that needs to happen, is that I put a room temperature prey item in front of it and boom, they eat. That visual presentation and that little bit of scent is enough to get them to eat. If they are less well established, maybe there's more contingencies I need to put into place. I need to present them with that room temperature feeder, but I need to wiggle it, or maybe I need to warm it to change the scent, the temperature profile. I increase the scent. Or maybe I need to warm it to increase the scent, warm it to make a heat profile, and wiggle it to make a visual stimulation. But the point being is that there are all these contingencies in place, and that's why a snake can go from looking like it's not going to strike to boom, it's striking. It's waiting for in place and go. It feeds. And if not all of those are in place, it will not feed. That's why you don't really get close to feeding. It's either like on or off most of the time. And similarly, I think that a snake can abort a feeding attempt if one of those contingencies is taken away, or if a masking factor comes into place. And so by that I mean that I think that like a masking factor would be, if you have an animal that feels slightly threatened by you, the fact that you're standing over it, waving something on tongs in front of it, your presence is a masking factor. You will not see that snake feed because of you. So you have to remove that masking factor, and if you put all the other contingencies in place for it to feed, it will feed. That's like why the bag trick works. I posted a video about that recently. And similarly, I don't know if you've ever had the experience, like I mentioned, like a Dumeral's boa, it bit me once, and it food wrapped me, but then the second time it spit me out. It's because it learned, it initiated its feed response. Bam, it bit me, and boom, immediately something wasn't right about all that contingencies that it had to prey select, and it aborted its feeding mission on me, if that makes sense. And so I've had that happen a couple of times where I've had usually mature, mentally stable snakes. I've had them come out like they might feed, and then they stop. And it's pretty remarkable. So prey selection is a really interesting thing, and I think it's pretty complicated, and I think that there are multiple contingencies that have to be in place for any feeding response. The more established an animal is, the less of those contingencies it will have to have in place to feed in captivity, but also it's pretty binary. It's either all the contingencies are met and it feeds, or all the contingencies are not met and it doesn't feed. So I hope that makes sense. This is a really messy video because it kind of has to be a messy video, but I hope that all these things I'm talking about are starting to kind of just plant seeds in your head about how I think about my snakes and how I think about my snake's cognition. And if any of that makes sense to you, or if you want me to add anything more or talk about something or break any one of these out into a very specific video in and of itself, I'm happy to do that. But I just wanted to put that out for you. And if you disagree with this, or if you think you see it differently, post it in the comments, because this is just my opinions about working with animals for a while, but it doesn't mean they're 100% correct. That's just what I put out there. Thank you for your attention today. Have a great day. Bye-bye.